So good afternoon, everybody. This is James McLeod, the Director of Community at FINOS. Welcome to the FINOS Virtual Meetup, where I am joined by Denise Cooper, the VP of Special Initiatives at Nearform. And just to give you a little bit of background to Denise, Denise has a 30+ years technology career, where 20 of those plus were in open source, and where she was the first open source officer and also established the first corporate open source office. She's formerly CTO of the Wikimedia Foundation and is classed as the high priestess of InnerSource. And she's also helped 100+ companies through their open source journey through her consultancy, Denese Works. Now, Denise joins us today to take us through debunking common fears about open source. And if you have any questions for Denise, please put them in the WebEx chat, which you'll be able to find in the bottom icons of your screen. And today, FINOS will be giving away 2 free t-shirts to two people picked at random. So if you've registered for today's event, you'll be picked off that list. If you haven't registered for today's event, if you could go to the FINOS LinkedIn page and find the event there and then quickly register, you'll be put into the draw. And also remember to go to LinkedIn and Twitter, where you can find FINOS, and you can subscribe to us on LinkedIn and also follow us on Twitter. And if you browse to finos.org, you'll be able to find our Get Involved page, where you'll be able to find out more about the foundation and also register for newsletters. And then finally, if you are a developer or an engineer, please visit us at github.com/FINOS, where you'll be able to start contributing directly into our projects. And with that, I'd like to pass the mic over to Denise. Welcome to today's session.
Thank you so much, James, and welcome everybody. So I'm here to talk about fear of open source and some of the common fears that we hear over and over again when we talk to new industries that are just getting started in the open source area. So first, I wanted to give you my Twitter handle, just in case you were going to tweet this thing, because it wasn't on the intro slide that I was given by the FINOS guys. And here we go. So first of all, I'd like you to know that you're afraid of open source mostly because somebody tried really hard to make you afraid of open source. 20 years ago, there was a concerted effort by a handful of companies whose business models were directly in the crosshairs of the open source world. You have to remember that open source happened around the same time as Napster, and people were looking at the violent changes happening in the online music industry.
SEO unit.
Hello? Hi.
Okay, Denise, don't worry, I'm keeping an eye on people's mute, and so please keep on going. Thank you.
The online music industry was scaring the pants off of the traditional software industry. And so notably Microsoft, but not only Microsoft, were doing everything they could to spread fear, uncertainty, and doubt about open source. And it was a surprisingly concerted effort. They actually hired attorneys to write fake white papers about open source licensing to create some doubt there. They did a lot of lobbying within the markets where they were, most influential to keep it out of those places. It was a whole thing. And a lot of the questions that we get asked today are still the same ones that they seeded way back then. So now that Microsoft is a friend of open source, it's pretty entertaining, actually. I was asked by Microsoft a couple of months ago to give a talk about the history of Microsoft's journey in open source, and which I researched. I actually talked to a lot of people, went over a lot of old, spent some time in the Wayback Machine, to look at exactly what happened when. And what I discovered was that they are pretty much unaware of that roadmap that they were on. 2 days after my talk, Brad Smith, who was the head attorney at Microsoft when I worked there and is still the head attorney, admitted publicly that they had gotten it wrong about open source. So that's pretty great to hear. There were a couple of other things that happened, though. The SCO case, which was some people at the Santa Cruz operations trying to shake some money out of IBM for supposedly using their code without permission, because some of their code, they said, had made it into Linux. And there were some documents claiming that that was a gift they gave to the Linux community. IBM, to their credit, stayed the course on that long lawsuit, an expensive lawsuit, to make sure that the SCO threat was completely dead, that the Linux kernel's provenance was completely explored, and that everybody agreed that Linux was not ripping anybody off. Another big fear moment that this community had was recently when the Heartbleed thing happened. And what that exposed was that there still are some key pieces of the internet tooling, which are mostly open source pieces, that are under surveilled, meaning that they didn't have much community built around the piece that broke, which meant that there wasn't anybody looking to see if problems had entered the picture. So the security model was not as solid as it needed to be, but it gained a lot of very quick support from the money behind open source to make sure that never, ever, ever, ever happens again. And a lot of companies will tell you about their contributions to making sure that that doesn't happen again. Okay, on to the fears. This is the number one fear that I hear from financial institutions and also, curiously, from municipalities, that it's too hard to find support, because people who sub out their development often want a throat to choke if something goes wrong. But interestingly enough, the probably most famous open source based company in the world, Red Hat, their whole business model was offering premium support on their versions of the open source software that people came to be dependent on. So their software was always open. You could always compile it yourself. Well, there was a minute there where that changed, but the open source community helped them back to the right road very quickly. And, you know, they sold for hundreds of millions, billions of dollars to IBM, based partly on their install base, but also partly on their mastery of that business model. And because that business model has been so successful, it's quite easy now to buy top quality support for your open source project. It's a little bit trickier if you're doing your own modifications, which is why we always advocate to send your modifications back upstream so that they can be supported in the main product, because it just makes it easier for you. So hopefully, to dispel this first myth, it's quite possible to find proper support now. Then there's concern that open source code are somehow the unwashed masses. This is a picture from Burning Man where they really literally are the unwashed masses. And there are a lot of programmers that go to Burning Man. But open source programmers are the best programmers in the world. They are paid more money because they're willing to work in the clear. The fact that they're willing to allow their software to be inspected just means that they're more careful going into it. Nobody wants to be publicly embarrassed. They feel confident that they're at the place where they can defend the choices they've made in their code. And, you know, there are so many companies that wouldn't exist without the work of these excellent developers. At this point, calling them the unwashed masses is a little unfair, I think. Okay. Next, we have the question of security. And this was a huge issue at the beginning of open source. Microsoft spent a lot of time trying to undermine open source based alone on security. They kept saying, how can it be secure if everybody can see the code? And they were betting that people would fall for that because of the prevalent notion during World War II that secrets needed to be kept. But the truth is, security through obscurity has been shown to be a complete crock a long time ago. But just to be clear about this, when I was starting out in open source, I was working with a gentleman named Whitfield Diffie. And Whit Diffie is the co-inventor of Diffie-Hellman encryption. He was the chief security officer at Sun. And, you know, Diffie-Hellman encryption is what makes it possible to do commerce on the web. So I asked him what he thought about open versus closed security. And he thought about it a long time before he answered me. What he said was, I see no statistical proof that either system is better, but we can look at the qualitative data that shows us how much faster the response to a known vulnerability is in the open source world. It's measured in hours, not weeks or months like it is in the proprietary side. So that tends to have me believe that open source is inherently more secure. And then as a little kicker to that, he said, you know, we do know that most malicious acts of code are perpetrated by disgruntled employees who have access to proprietary code that's not surveilled very carefully. So you can think about that for a minute. Generally, it's believed now that the way that open source security is handled is the gold standard for security. And it is everywhere. It is in mission critical, you know, or life critical uses every day. And you better believe that those people double check. They look carefully before they incorporate new software, but they're generally not having to fix those problems. All right. Then there's the concern that there's sort of not defined rational decision making going on. And this is sort of like the unwashed masses fear. This is another one that was seeded a long time ago. But the truth is, these days, all of the major projects have very defined decision making process. A lot of press was given to the Apache Software Foundation deciding that you could assume goodwill. You could assume that you're going to be fine and be ready to roll back your changes if somebody objects, right? That's sort of their motto so that they can keep moving forward. But what's interesting about that is they have a very defined process and they actually vote on all of the important things. If it's a major change, if it's the entry of a new person into a level of responsibility, if it's accepting a new project into the organization, considering a project top level, considering a project ready for release, all of these things require actual votes, not Rochambeau votes, but a real voting. And all of those decisions are both documented and archived so that you can go look at them again. So in many ways, open source is far better in terms of how decisions are made, how they're documented, whether or not you can inspect them. And there's very little chaos about it. Okay, now we have the difficult problem of how do I make money if I don't own the intellectual property? Okay, this might be a little bit of a new idea to you guys. It's been talked about in the open source world for a long time. The patent system, as we know it, was designed for physical, mechanical inventions. And as such, the pace of change was much slower. The expertise that was required to make a good determination about the uniqueness of an idea was also a lower bar. Today's patent and trademark office in the US, which is the largest in the world, cannot hire enough qualified people to do real careful analysis of the uniqueness of what's being submitted. So a lot more patents are being granted without deep observation, deep analysis. And as a result, in patent court, something like a third of patents are actually being upheld. The other 2/3 are being struck down because they're bogus. And that's especially happening around business method patents, because the other trend is there are very few foundational patents being filed now. It's mostly business method patents. So the difference there, a foundational patent is a unique invention. It's not just a change in the way that you do things. And a business method patent is a change in the way you do things. So Amazon owns a patent for something called one-click. The idea that a company could invent a single click gets you the answer that you need is ridiculous, right? There are a lot of other patents like that that are ridiculous. And when that patent was filed, Tim O'Reilly of O'Reilly Publishing wrote a blog saying this is ridiculous. And Jeff Bezos answered him. It's a long time ago. Jeff used to do his own mail. And he said, dude, I have to do this because my investors want me to stockpile value, and this is the way to do that. But I agree with you that it's broken. So let's go to Washington. So they went to Washington together. And Tim, who's a friend of mine, came back from that meeting really depressed. In a week, they were in 50 lawmaker offices. This was during the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration. They were in 50 different offices. They saw 2 working computers on lawmakers' offices. And they thought, oh my God, the problem here is that everybody in power is too old to get what we're talking about. So nothing's going to change. Tim was like, it's never going to change. And then Obama got elected. And there was a sea change in Washington. People from Silicon Valley moved into DC to help out as fast as they could. Obama hired the first CTO the country had ever had. Think about that. It is a huge percentage of our GDP in America, and yet there had never been a technical person sitting in the White House. But now there was. However, the patent system has continued to be difficult to change because they literally can't hire the expertise. Anybody who's good enough to be a patent examiner is not going to work for civil service wages. They're off working for the big tech companies. So it's a broken system. This is not how to get ROI out of your software anymore. It's a serious long shot unless you're doing foundational patents, and nobody's doing those. In Europe, business method patents aren't even acceptable yet. So clinging to your IP is a bad idea. What makes more sense is building your business. I mean, go ahead and make IP, patent it if you must, but don't hesitate to open source your code if it gives you a different advantage. And some of those advantages might include you get more customers out of it. The last 2 really big sales of open source companies have been that the inflated values of those companies came out of their install base or their customer base, or their expertise in a specific open source method. So that's where your ROI lives now. So, don't be fooled by the old-fashioned ways. All right. Then there's people whose proprietary partners don't like open source, and they're afraid that if they do it, they're going to get in trouble. This is another Microsoft thing that happened. They had the entire subcontinent of India terrified of using open source because they were going to pull their funding from the educational system if that happened. This is, up to about 15 years ago. And then Satya Nadella shows up, and all of a sudden it's cool to do open source in India. And they dove right in. Now they've got laws on the books about public code being, stuff that's paid for with taxpayer dollars has to be open source in India now. They're working on curricula to teach it in schools. I mean, they've made a big leap. This picture, by the way, is from the week in 2000 when IBM decided that they were going to make public the fact that they were making a big bet on Linux. And they stenciled this design all over the sidewalks around this conference they were talking at in San Francisco. But they had neglected to get a proper permit for this piece of street art, and they got fined a lot of money for doing it. So people have bled real money for their love of open source, and big companies have been doing it a long time. At this point, it's table stakes, and if the company you're working with doesn't like it, you probably need to dump them. All right. Then there's concern, again, this is more of the unwashed masses thing, about how uncertain ship dates and future shipping is. You can't plan around it. The future is uncertain, which is why you have a climate change beach shack there. So here's the truth about this one. Most projects, if anything, ship too often for you. So we have for many years now been advocating a pattern where they create a very stable repository that only once a year maybe they move. They port fixes to it, but pretty much it just stays the same for a longer period of time. They put all of the new development into a dev release, which means that your engineers can be testing the new features and integrating to them before the big stable release comes out for the next version, which should make your conversions a little bit better, and you won't feel so pressured to do the latest thing without knowing that you like it. And most of the big projects are working that way now. So I think that this is actually kind of a moot point again. Now you're going to get a very quick licensing primer, because licensing is confusing. However, you have the advantage of being with FINOS, which means that if you release your code under, their auspices, you will be using the Apache Software License version 2, which is a great license. But let's go through it quickly. On the right-hand side, you have proprietary. It's just there because it's the anchor against which we measure everything else. On the left, the far left, you have the inheritance or viral licenses. They don't like that name viral very much. They're also called the copyleft licenses because they use copyright in an interesting way to make sure that the code is always going to be available. And the famous one is the GPL, or GNU Public License. And then there's some others we'll talk about again in a second. Now, if you look next to proprietary, just to the left of proprietary, you see permissive. That's the center, the most easy to digest licenses. I will tell you from personal experience, the most likely to drive deep adoption are the permissive licenses, MIT, BSD, and Apache. I call these copy center licenses, both because they're in the center between proprietary and copyleft, but also because you can just go down to the copy center and make as many copies as you want, because the licenses literally say, just use our software. We're not going to sue you. The Apache is the gold standard because it does have language about both trademark and IP treatment. So that's why everybody has gotten around those two. The other two are very brief licenses, but they are all sort of the same conceptually. And then the Mozilla license is a hybrid license, meaning that it acts like a permissive license until some condition is broken and it changes to being a viral or inheritance license. So it's sort of the best of both worlds, or at least it looked that way to a lot of companies, but it turns out to be a bad idea to use that license for everyday use because it creates smaller pools of code, less reuse. All of these licenses, except for the proprietary and the Affero, trigger on distribution. And since most code is now presented to consumers behind a SaaS wall, as software as a service wall, so it's being performed over a browser or over an app, you're not actually shipping open source code like the Linux operating system. If you're using it in your shop, it's not being shipped to the customer. So you're not actually triggering any of the requirements that you open your code along with them. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of idea. Remember, again, none of this matters if you're going with FINOS. They've already chosen the best license. All right, and then the last one is that community requires resources. And that more and more people tell me they just don't have time to build that. But that is so misguided. The community is, in fact, the whole value almost of open source. I mean, yes, it is cheaper to acquire, but the way that you pay for it is by building community, because you know about the tragedy of the commons, where if you overgraze the commons dies, right? Feeding back into the system is how you pay for the use of that software. And you do that by building community around the stuff that you open source, or by participating in community when you donate contributions upstream. This is very key, and anybody who misses this point is going to be disappointed in their open source engagements. All right, so after listening to all of that, if you plan to open source, you might as well make it effective. So I'm going to give you a very quick version of how to do that. I decided a little while ago to help one of my employees by giving them a quick set of questions they could ask to sort through proposed open source projects to see whether they were going to be a good idea or not before we wasted time on them. So I'm going to give them to you now. Number one, does anybody care aside from you and your mom? This is a hard concept to grasp if you think that you are going to be like Apple, where you do these events with the big reveal. But the big reveal is really costly in terms of your ability to actually get the work done. It's, in my opinion, an unwieldy and bad idea in like 99.99% of cases. And so it's perfectly reasonable to send an engineer to a meetup like the ones that James runs, have them pitch the idea of this being open source, and not as a done deal, but as a look how clever we are. We built this thing. Would it be helpful to you guys if we open source this? Come and see me later at the end of the show. And if nobody turns up, that should tell you something. Don't bother. Okay? There are hundreds of thousands of projects that have been open source that nobody cares about. You don't want your brand associated with one of them. Secondly, are you still using it? People tend to want to dump code that they don't want to support anymore, or that they have an engineer who worked on it and loved it, but now they need him to do something else. So they promise him that they'll open source it, but he's going to want to work on that instead of the new thing, probably, unless he's actually leaving the company and you want him to go ahead and start a company with that stuff that he worked on for you that you're not using. But in general, if you're not using whatever it is, you don't want to open source it. Okay. Next, are you still improving it? Assuming that somebody cares, you found somebody, and you're still using it. Are you still improving it, or do you think it's perfect now? If you think it's perfect, it's a bad candidate for open source, because you're not going to be able to build community if there aren't things left to do. People think they have to polish the code to a fine gloss before they release it, but that is the wrong impetus. What you want to do is get in the habit of writing good code, but also being honest within your code. So it's okay to tag a given part of the code, this needs to be replaced, or another part, this is a bit of a hack, but we were trying to redo it, or this is an area that you could help. This is all cool because it leaves people points of integration. So don't over polish. And then the last one, after you have submitted the thing as an open source project, made your splash, can there only be one tree, please? Can you kill the version that you keep inside the firewall that you work on? If you keep working on that inside the firewall, instead of working as a regular community member out in the project, you are going to be tempted to throw stuff over the wall once you've got it polished up, and that will also disincent your community horribly. There have been some very famous, very heavily funded open source projects by corporations that died that way. Notably, the Darwin project that Apple did when they switched to the mock kernel. They got the best possible person, they set it up, they gave it a lot of airspace, but they could not break themselves of the habit of building stuff inside the firewall and then catapulting it over the wall. Don't do it. Okay. And now for questions.
Thank you very much, Denise. So we do have a few minutes for anybody who has a question, but before we go over to questions, I'd like to announce the winners of the FINOS t-shirts that we will be shipping to you. So the first person who has been picked at random is Alexander Phillips from Capital One. Congratulations, Alexander. And the second person is Ken Long from JP Morgan, who incidentally, both of those firms are FINOS members. So thank you very much for attending and being here today. And thanks for the round of applause, Denise. So, okay, normally I actually ask people if they can drop their questions in the chat, but if there's anybody on the line who would like to come off mute, feel free to come off mute and ask your question to Denise directly.
Hey, James, this is Rob, your colleague. How are you?
Hi, Rob. I'm very well, thank you.
I just wanted to say, as always, great job. Really wonderful presentation. And I just wanted to highlight that last point of no catapulting. So many good nuggets in the presentation. I think that's probably my favorite. That catapulting thing, really, truly, authentically working in the open is, and really doing your builds and really doing your commits and pull requests to the public repository and not catapulting is perhaps the most important thing. I know as we're going through the Alloy project, that's one of the things that our member Goldman Sachs is really committed to, is as it open sources Alloy, really working hard to make sure that the open source code is going to be the de facto and public version that it's going to be doing its builds on. And that's a commitment that a bunch of our members have made as they've open sourced. So I just wanted to highlight that. It's a really
that's a great practice. That's a really great practice, because it's not open source otherwise. We used to call that, I said catapulting, we used to call it tarball flinging, but people don't know what a tarball is anymore.
Yeah. That's amazing, Rob. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rob.
I really appreciate that. And if anybody else would like to come off mute and, say hi and maybe, pass a comment or, ask a question, feel free to do so.
Gosh, James, maybe I answered all the questions. It'd be great
maybe.
if the spheres are done now.
Hello?
Oh.
Hi. Nice to meet you. I'm Jean-Gabriel from Banking SDK. I just have a small question, maybe, which is what's the best way to build a community around an open source product?
Well, the main thing is that you have to put yourself in the shoes of a contributor that isn't working for you or with you. And you have to bend over way backwards to make sure that those contributors have an easy ramp to get involved. Open source works based on enlightened self-interest. So you have to be giving people an intrinsic good feeling about contributing to your project, right? And so making it easy, making it fun, making them feel accomplished for getting it done. These are all good ideas. There's some famous projects like Drupal, for instance, which is a content management system, quite a large one, that every time they get together, they have what's called a public check-in, where they randomly pick somebody from their hackathon who's done an interesting piece of work, and they publicly do the code review that is required before it's merged. So that poor person is standing there while one of the main people from the project reads their code, but they're doing it in the most celebratory way because they've pre-checked it to make sure it's probably going to be okay, right? And at the moment that they merge it, everybody and they'll have an auditorium full of 500 people watching this, everybody claps. And that community member is instantly hooked. They want to do it again. So finding ways to celebrate the contributions that come your way is worth doing. It doesn't have to be that homegrown. There's lots of ways to do it. But the art of managing communities, what we used to call community management, I prefer community gardening now because it's a little bit more like that, is about 20 years old now. We're getting pretty good at it. And there are some good books about how to do it. My friend John O'Bacon wrote a book 10 years ago now called The Art of Community. That's pretty good. And then he just recently wrote another book about how you can use that community to do amazing things for your brand and your product after you've attracted them. So it helps you understand why you would bother, right? Is that helpful?
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for the question.
That's amazing, Denise. Thank you very much. And I've actually just dropped my email address in the chat, so james@finos.org. Being the Director of Community at the Fintech Open Source Foundation, I'm more than happy to have any discussions with people who are interested in building communities or joining our own, for that matter. And with that, Denise, thank you very much for taking part in this afternoon's virtual meetup with the FINOS team.
You're welcome, James. And I will see you over at the Linux Foundation in about 5 hours.
Absolutely. So Denise is actually talking at the Open Source Summit this evening UK time. So if anybody's going along, make sure that you drop in on Denise's talk. Thank you very much, Denise Keeper, VP of Special Initiatives at Nearform, for joining us today. Have a great day.
And thank you to Nearform as well, as ever, for making it possible for me to do these speeches. So
that's amazing. Thank you, everybody, for being here. And remember to subscribe to FINOS on LinkedIn, where you'll hear all of our up and coming webinars and other events as well. Have a great day.